There you go. We're up.
Yeah. I have the PowerPoints up behind Zoom.
Okay, good. I'll put that up in a minute. Mute my computer.
And I may have to have you come and put on the PowerPoint.
Okay.
Oh. At least I can hear you, Dr. Hinton.
Okay.
All right.
Well,
Can I say something? Just a reminder, because we've got a few new folks today. I'm going to mute everybody. And if you have questions, use your chat function, or we will unmute folks at the end of the class, and Dr. Hinson will answer questions then.
okay. Thank you. Well, today we move forward on the long journey from Galilee to Jerusalem by way of Jericho. I put up a map earlier which wasn't at all clear, and I had a new map made that maybe helps you to see a little bit better what a journey from Galilee to Jericho and then to Jerusalem would be. If you see here on the map, Samaria adjoins Galilee, and how far into Samaria Jesus and the disciples went is very uncertain. But you'll notice here from the red lines that there was a route from Samaria over to the Jordan River. And it's very likely that that would have been the route that Jesus would have taken, going down through Sychar, Sodom, and on down alongside the Jordan, and then to Jericho. Jericho below sea level, just before you get to the Dead Sea. And that meant, of course, they would have quite a climb going from Jericho to Jerusalem. Now, along the way, he was having debates with people about his ministry to the outcasts of Jewish society. Tax collectors and sinners flocked to him, and he included tax collectors among his disciples. And as these crowds of tax collectors and people who were not highly regarded in Jewish society flocked to him, the Pharisees and scribes grumbled. This fellow welcomes sinners and eats with them. Eating, of course, was a symbol of acceptance. And in the minds of the Pharisees, it was a no-no. You weren't to eat with lowlifes, with ne'er-do-wells, sinners, tax collectors, people like that. And in chapter 15, we pick up Jesus' defense of his ministry and extension to it widely. I think laying a foundation for the expansion of Christianity to the Gentile. Again, supporting what Paul would do eventually. Here in chapter 15, we have these three touching parables about the lost sheep, the lost coin, and the lost son, or actually, more accurately, the loving father. In those, Jesus articulated images of God, not as a stern schoolmaster, ready to rap his pupils on the knuckles for every infraction, but as one who reaches out to those who don't measure up even to their own standards, the lost and forsaken. Now, Luke followed Jesus' defense of his association and ministry to outcasts with a critique of obsession with wealth rather than love of God and of neighbor. Jesus began this critique with a parable which baffles almost anybody who reads it, unless you make room for his use of irony. In the parable of the shrewd steward, he encouraged his followers as the children of light to act as cannily as the children of this age. Following up on that, then he urged the disciples to choose between God and wealth or mammon in the text of the Hebrew. He responded to ridicule by the Pharisees, lovers of wealth, as he presented them, by pointing out that their self-justification would not satisfy God, who knows your hearts. And then after brief interjections about the law continuing and being applicable and about divorce, he returned to the issue of wealth with the parable of the rich man and poor Lazarus. I think these two chapters, 15 and 16, are among the favorites in the gospel according to Luke. He began here in this 15th chapter with his defense of ministry to the outcast, the wideness of God's mercy. Almost all of the material in defense of outcasts and also in criticism of wealth is exclusive to Luke. Obviously, he was doing something which neither Mark nor Matthew did. In both of them, Jesus confined his ministry to the Jewish people. But in Luke, you have this effort, of course, at extending it not just to good Jews, but to everybody. Although some scholars have theorized that Jesus probably created most of this to support his view of the wideness of God's mercy, it seems wiser to assume that Luke collected some parables and other materials through his association with Paul, and perhaps drew from another source. Paul probably quoted Jesus' parables in various other things, as we can find here and there in his letter. It is true that Luke's defense of Jesus' association with and ministry to outcasts laid a foundation for the expansion of the early church beyond the bounds of Judaism, recorded in the Acts of the Apostles. Luke extending what he saw in the ministry of Jesus here to the Acts of the Apostles. That development, however, would not necessitate the supposition that Luke made up the parable. It is far more likely that Jesus himself, a master of storytelling, created the parables. Now, first, the setting for Jesus' response. According to Luke, Jesus attracted more and more people despised and ostracized by Jewish society. Indeed, tax collectors may have stood on the lowest rung of popular estimation, where they collected taxes for the occupiers of Israel, the Romans, and many finagled a little extra for themselves. People habitually associated tax collectors with sinners. Sinners probably included a wide range of ne'er-do-wells, but especially prostitutes. You find that in several of the stories. In the mind of the respectable and respected, such as the Pharisees and the scribes, such associations, particularly eating with them, blackened Jesus' reputation. The eating just gave him the final charge against Jesus for violating the rule, the Holocaust. Jesus responded to this with his well-crafted parable. Now, first, parable of the lost sheep. Jesus presented this parable, as he did many others, in question form. Which of you, losing one sheep out of a flock of 100, would not leave the 99 and hunt for the one lost sheep? And when you find it, put it on your shoulder, rejoicing, and then returning home, call together friends and neighbors to celebrate with you for finding the one lost lamb. By analogy, there will be more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous persons who need no repentance. Obviously, a reference to the Pharisees as being the ultimate paragons of righteousness in Jewish society of this day. The image of the Good Shepherd became a favorite among early Christians. It was one of the most popular frescoes in the Catacombs during the years Christianity was a persecuted sect in Rome. Of course, the catacombs were burial places, and they held funerals there. They had certain rooms in which they could conduct the funerals, and then the bodies of the deceased were put in loculi hewn into the sides of that soft stone. A Christian artist also featured the Good Shepherd in statuary as well as there. Early on, the artist produced the image of the Greek god Hermes, But in time, they took pains to depict images of the shepherd carrying the lamb on his shoulder, derived from Jesus' parable. God, the God we have come to know through Jesus Christ, looks out for the lost and forsaken. That is the image. And here is one of these frescoes. You'll notice that around the edges is an octagon. The octagon symbolized the 8th day, the day of resurrection. So it had very important symbolic importance in the catacombs. But here you have a kind of combination of the art. Probably this was painted in the middle of the stage of transition from relying entirely on Greek painting, or Greek and Roman painting. This is actually the god Hermes there, holding in the right hand what would be the instrument for calling the sheep. And then you have, on the other hand, the sheep upon the shoulders of the shepherd, and the other sheep lying around. It shows you how this transition ultimately took place. They moved increasingly into Gentile society, and they employed Gentiles as artists, first of all, and then eventually more Christians themselves took over the artwork for. Well, then there was the parable of the lost coin. Jesus again challenged the critics by putting the parable in question form. What woman losing one of 10 silver coins doesn't light a lamp, sweep the house, and search until she finds it? And when she finds it, calls together her friends and neighbors to rejoice with her. Now, one coin like this would be particularly precious in Palestine, with you have the limited amounts of money and so on that they had, and so this would occasion a moment of great importance. It'd be like an anniversary or a birthday or something like that. So she called her friends and neighbors to rejoice that she found that coin that she probably had wept about losing and so on. And Jesus here tinkered with the celestial imagery a bit, but it meant the same thing. There is joy in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner who repents. And both of these parables of the Good Shepherd and of the lost coin underscore the same idea about God. God is partial to those most desperately in need of help. The ones maybe who would be forsaken by virtually everybody else. And that stands out now more starkly in the third parable, probably the most loved of Jesus' parables. Long usage probably will preclude this my titling of it being taken over, but I propose changing the name of this parable from the parable of the prodigal son to the parable of the loving father. The opening sentence strongly supports that change. The Greek text reads, "And he said, a certain man had two sons." So you can see the focus is not on the prodigal only, but it's on the father. In addition, the parable consists of two roughly equal parts. The first about the prodigal son, and the second about the prodigal pouty elder brother. What holds the two parts together is the loving father who went out to embrace both sons, and both needed his embrace. Changing the title may seem to diminish somewhat the focus on loss in Jesus' argument, his defense of ministry to the lost. Actually, I think it enhances the argument by directing attention to the father's action toward both sons. Most scholars would think of the stay-at-home son, the elder brother, as symbolic of the Pharisees, critical of Jesus in reaching out toward the unworthy. The way the Father thinks and acts is the way God, Abba, thinks and acts, with infinite compassion that makes room for both sons. To appreciate this masterful parable fully, we need to enter into it in imagination, as Ignatius Loyola recommended. What he recommended was if there's a scene in which there are animals smell the manure. I don't know whether our acquaintance with animals is that extensive enough these days for us to do that. But Loyola, who, by the way, used the Gospel of Luke as his example, teaching about the proper kind of meditation. The younger son, probably fed up with home and dad and older brother, demanded his inheritance. His father stepped outside the usual customs. He figured out what the inheritance would come to for both sons and gave each of them his part. It's actually described as his whole livelihood, his possessions, everything that he had that would come at the end of his life. A few days later, the prodigal departed and went off to a country far removed from home. He was just sick and tired of home, of dad, of his brother, everything. And he wanted to get as far away as he could. There, he soon squandered what money he had in dissolute living. He had a wild fling while the money lasted, but disaster struck. A famine, which was a common occurrence in ancient society. They did not have the kind of economic system that we have put together today since the Great Depression to deal with something like this. But a famine put the prodigal in desperate straits. He had to get a job. Now, what a job for a Jew, tending swine. You know, swine would be among the forbidden according to the law, very clearly prohibited. If that wasn't bad enough, he got so hungry that he wanted to eat the swill from the pig trough. And nobody gave him anything to eat. So you can imagine the desperation that this young man felt. It is portrayed very graphically in that eating the swill from the pig trough. As in a jillion other cases, when he was looking up to see bottom, a light turned on. He came to himself. That I think is such a graphic way of expressing it. He began for the first time in his life to lay off what Thomas Merton would talk about as false images that had been developed. And now he discovered himself. He began to think. Menial servants in his father's house had enough bread and to spare. In a flash then, he knew what he would do. He would put pride aside, go home and confess, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me like one of your hired hands. He had done the one thing he needed to do. He had humbled himself, stripping away his ego and his egotism. He went home. That's very touching, isn't it? It gets right to the heart of what it is to become a Christian. We'll find it again in the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. Tax collector only able to beat his breast and say, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. But here we discover what this loving Father was really like. He had never stopped looking down the road. For it says in the text, while the son was still far off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. He ran and put his arms around him and kissed him. Oh, and that just melts your insides, seeing that compassion. I just finished a volume by a Dominican monk in which he argues that compassion was the central concern of Jesus and his central concept of God. All was forgiven. The prodigal couldn't even get out his whole spiel. His father didn't let him ask to be treated as one of the hired hand, which is all he had a right to ask for. Because you see, he had squandered everything he had inherited as a son. But instead, the father took him back as his son. He made it crystal clear, directing his slaves to bring the best robe and put it on him, to put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet, and kill the fatted calf, the grain-fed calf, to eat and to celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. Oh, that is wrenching to me to read those words. What a powerful defense of ministry to the unworthy, despised, rejected, and forsaken, and by extension to the Gentiles. Is this not as close as we humans can get to an understanding of Abba? Our Abba Imam never gives up looking for and hoping for the errant one's return. Races down the road with heart wide open to embrace and kiss them, adopts them back into the family, and celebrates their return. And I think that would, in our context, extend to God's embrace of people of different ethnic backgrounds, of color, people who are gay, lesbian, all those different things that seem to divide our society at the moment. As the father also in the parable went out to the pouty elder brother. It's not hard to understand the elder brother's resentment. He was out in the fields working when the prodigal son came home. When he drew near the house, he heard music and dancing. He had to ask one of the serving women, "What's going on?" She told him, "Your brother has come home, and your father has killed the grain-fed calf." Now you can imagine how this would build up inside. How every resentment he had towards his brother, who had taken, had left the family not in pleasant circumstances at all. He exploded and will not go into the house. So his father came out to him just as he had for the other son. That came out is the central thing. Well, it doesn't take much imagination to see how his anger would boil over. He spewed out the anger he had held up inside for months and years. You can sense him seething and snorting, maybe his voice breaking, and he almost weeping. For all these years, I have been working like a slave for you, and I have never disobeyed your command. Yet you've never given me even a young coat so that I might celebrate with my friends. Oh, but when this son of yours came back, who had devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fatted calf for him. Note there, he avoided the word brother. This is not his brother. He had disowned him. Abba had to handle this like a live grenade. How can you cool him off? In his rage, he would repeat any explanation and rebuff any attempt at conciliation. Yet the father must try. The modern translations do not reflect this, and this is an argument for learning the language. But Luke changed the word, the father changed the word he used to address the son. He changed son, huios, to child, teknon. Now, I've thought about that a whole lot. I don't think the father meant it as a slight, but as a term of endearment, the counterpart of can't you sense gentleness in his voice as he said, child, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. With a sweep of his arms to indicate the whole estate. He had given the elder son his part of the inheritance earlier. So the latter would now own all that remained. I don't know whether this happened or not, but maybe it soothed injured feelings somewhat. But I suspect the elder son was too enraged at this time for the point to get through. But it mattered that the father could add an apology for what he had done. In it, he expressed the main point of the parable. But we had to celebrate and rejoice because this brother of yours was dead and has come to life. He was lost and has been found. Just as the father had owned the prodigal as his son, so now must the elder brother own him as his brother and rejoice. That says something, I think, about what the church is to be. a lot of times we think, especially of churches being all those good people, the nice people, the ones that's easy to like, to love, to have fun with. But what we're being reminded here is the church is made up of people whom we may not like, whom we will have trouble loving, but still we have to love because they are brothers and sisters. Well, this parable of a loving father stretches tentacles in many directions. Jesus employed it first to defend his association with and mission to outcasts. In the way Luke used it, it held implications for the mission to the Gentiles. The Jews did not look on any more favorably than they did outcasts. As you think back on it, the whole of the Hebrew Bible, there is a kind of narcissism there, isn't there? A concept of being the chosen, whereas the whole remainder of the world would be reject. And unfortunately, a lot of that thinking has been taken over into the church too. In a broader sense, Jesus used this parable to bear witness to the wideness of God's mercy. If God can save prodigals and sinners who repent, tax collectors, whom can't God save? Inherent within all of this, of course, is an understanding of God as a loving Father who reaches out to embrace all humankind to God's self. Well, the second part of the section that we're dealing with, this chapter 16, is about God and mammon, or God and wealth. No early Christian, we've already seen in looking at the Sermon on the Plain, spoke as forcefully as Luke did against maldistribution of wealth, both in the gospel and in the Acts of the Apostles. I wish we had Luke still around to help us in our society, where maldistribution of wealth is probably greater than it was in Jesus' day, or even in the Roman Empire in Jesus' day. In Luke's gospel, Jesus did his best to get his followers to put God first and to store up treasures in heaven rather than amassing wealth on earth. At the same time, he touted God's compassionate partiality toward the poor, the needy, the helpless. In this section, Luke has assembled some of Jesus' most searching statements about wealth. Jesus counseled his disciples to act as shrewdly in regard to heavenly treasure as a canny manager did toward his future when his purloining of his master's property cost him his job. He added a reminder that stewardship in this life will set the stage for faithful stewardship in the life to come. He chastened his Pharisee critics for hypocrisy and placing wealth first, while they pretended to place God first. After interjecting a couple of comments about continuing viability of the law and about divorce, Jesus told the parable of the rich man and poor Lazarus. Probably can't get closer to his main point than in that parable, in which he warned that those who spurned the instruction of Abraham, Moses, and the prophets in this life did not expect a bailout from above. Well, it begins with the parable of the shrewd steward. And I have to admit, this has been one of the toughest parables I've had to wrestle with to try to find some way to understand. Jesus here moved from interaction with an audience composed of tax collectors, sinners, Pharisees, and scribes about his mission to the lost to focus attention on deceitful and potent pool of earthly goods and wealth. By this stage, the inner core of his disciples should have absorbed his message concerning priority. He could not be sure and tried with parables to drive home the message of God first, and everything else subordinated to that allegiance. See, we've already seen those teachings in chapter 12 in Matthew in the Sermon on the Mount about placing God first above everything, and then other things will fall into place. The parable of the shrewd steward or manager probably caught these first hearers by surprise, as it does me and any modern reader. It sounded like Jesus was commending a deed at best questionable and at worst immoral. How should we interpret that last comment as a conclusion to this whole parable? I think we should see clearly that the parable commended shrewdness in view of the approaching disaster and not pursuit of dishonest wealth, a trait all too common in our free enterprise society. For Jesus' followers, the disaster had to do with judgment on their horizon, when God would decide whether they would enter the eternal kingdom. His counsel was that they should not wait until disaster struck, but act decisively now while they had time to act, as the shrewd steward did. He prepared when he would not have be able to provide for himself, so he better get things right before that time. I think I have to see that as the use of irony on the part of Jesus, maybe even a little sarcasm. Well, we come to that now in this parable and what follows. If some disciples fail to draw the right conclusion from the parable of the shrewd steward, they could find clarification in this footnote. What we do about wealth is a matter of character. Someone faithful in little things will be faithful in big ones. Someone who is untrustworthy in little things will be untrustworthy in big ones. If you're not faithful with some other person's property, who will entrust you with something of far greater value? Eternal riches. No slave can serve two masters at the same time. They will hate one and love the other. You cannot serve God and wealth, God and man. Yes, that's the point. If your allegiance is to money, you will not pledge your whole self to God and serve God alone. If your allegiance is to God, you will not devote yourself to money. Now, I don't know where that puts a lot of people in our society today, starting at the top with our commander-in-chief. We must be honest here to recognize the powerful attraction money has in American culture. Neither God nor human beings is the measure of all things in a culture that encourages acquisitions for its own sake. Why does money fascinate? In and of itself, it may not appeal to most people. The reason money becomes an obsession to many is because it gives power and permits people to exercise control over others and even over the natural world around them. And as a number of observers have pointed out today, we have widespread benefits coming to the rich as contrasted with the poor, especially, of course, we have African Americans, Hispanics, and others in our society who do not have benefits, even something like health control, health care that is readily accessible for those who have the money. The obsession with power and control has become acute in the United States as a result of a Supreme Court decision, Citizens United, recognizing corporations as persons and permitting the use of incalculable sums to elect people to public office. And by the way, the main author of that Citizens United outlook is Mitch McConnell. People of vast wealth can have altruistic motives, but few of them promote devotion to the one who is needful or to increase love of neighbor. Well, Jesus responded and to the ridicule of money-loving Pharisees. The Pharisees did not look approvingly on Jesus' harsh words about wealth. Luke ascribed their ridiculing of Jesus' teaching to the fact that they were lovers of money. And it would be unfair to tar all Pharisees with one brush, but they probably belonged to the more affluent class in Jewish society. At any rate, Jesus charged them with hypocrisy. They put on a good act that justified them in the sight of others. Judging by woe listed earlier, their justification involved scrupulous observance of the rules they based on Torah. They were the creators of it. Well, this seems to intrude upon what Jesus is saying here, but I think it has an appropriate place in the context, especially calling attention to the mistreatment of women in Jewish society. Jesus here sketched first salvation history. The law, the prophets, John the Baptist, the proclamation of the good news of the kingdom. That's the history of salvation. He added in a curious note about popular response to the kingdom, that everyone tries to enter it by force. And again, this is one of those statements very difficult for us to interpret, to be able to see the exact nuance of it, because we don't have enough of the context. According to Matthew's version, the violent take the kingdom by force. Who are the violent? And how did they try to enter or take it by force? Evidently, Jesus referred to the eager and ardent multitudes who first followed John the Baptist and then Jesus himself. They didn't approach casually. They stormed the kingdom. Lest his hearers think what was happening in the proclamation of the kingdom would detract from the law or eliminate it, he went on to observe that it was easier for heaven and earth to pass away than for one stroke of a letter in the law to be dropped. Matthew helps to clarify that assertion. In Matthew's version, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus declared that he had not come to abolish the law or the prophets, but to fulfill them, and expanded his declaration with an oath that until heaven and earth passed away, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Many of Jesus' contemporaries placed the prophets on a lower level than the law, so Luke added, are the prophets. The latter informed Jesus' mission just as much, if not more, than the law did. Now, regarding divorce, Luke reflects the influence of the Apostle Paul and diverges from Matthew vis-a-vis the exception Paul. In his letter to the Corinthians, Paul passed on as Jesus' teaching that the wife should not separate from her husband, But if she does separate, let her remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband, and that the husband should not divorce his wife. According to Matthew, a husband who divorces his wife except on the grounds of adultery causes her to commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. In Luke's version, Jesus reversed Jewish custom in placing responsibility on men. Anyone who divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery. And whoever marries a woman divorced from her husband commits adultery. In Judaism, women had no right to divorce their husband. But husbands could divorce their wives for burning their biscuit for any cost, no matter how simple. In modern American society, I think far too many take marriage vows too lightly, as a review of Jesus' attitude should remind us. Jesus significantly elevated the status of women, however, and helped Christians to view divorce with greater compassion and recognition that two persons can't always work out a loving and tender companionship in a society that imposes many demands on couples. It's probably an issue we will never ultimately resolve in a way that's satisfactory to most people, in a way that doesn't hurt some people, one side or another. But you have to recognize, as Paul has especially pointed out in the passage I quoted, that some do have to divorce, that there is no way to avoid it. Well, we come now to the parable of the rich man and poor Lazarus, picking up again more directly this problem about maldistribution of wealth. Luke did not try to create a setting for this parable, but it had some tie to what he had said about the law and the prophet. The rich man and his brothers should have taken them more seriously and learned from them to amend their thoughtless and ultimately damning attitude toward the less fortunate. Jesus painted a pitiful portrait of this rich man. He flaunted his wealth, dressing in purple and fine linen, and feasting sumptuously every day. Meantime, he ignored the tragic circumstances of the poor Lazarus lying at his gate. Sores covered the beggar's body, and dogs treated him more kindly than the rich man. They licked his sores. Lazarus longed to have some crumbs that dropped from the rich man's table, but nobody gave him any. Then came the great reversal. And Jesus liked to bring that in, to help people to grasp that reversal like this may happen in life. Both died. Angels transported Lazarus to Abraham's bosom in paradise. Abraham, of course, symbolized the ultimate in Jewish piety as the father of the Hebrew people. To be a child of Abraham was the key to salvation. As Jesus' affirmation of the tax collector Zacchaeus showed. The man who once had every whim met did not end up so happy. Jesus said simply that he died, was buried, and ended up in Hades in torment. He suffered excruciating thirst in that eternal furnace. The image there of a furnace of fires and so on came from the wadi outside Jerusalem where they kept garbage burning. The Gehenna. Jacking up the pain to an unbearable level. He could look over and see Lazarus lolling around in comfort in the bosom of Abraham. And notice Jesus' picture. Heaven is not way up there in the sky, and hell down in the belly of the earth. That's always fascinated me. They lie alongside one another so that the inhabitants could see one another. We must surely understand this metaphorically and not literally. I have to confess that I don't think of hell as a place or heaven as a place. Heaven is where God is. Hell is where God isn't. Neither of these fit an identifiable place in our universe, or at least I'm not able to visualize a place where either could exist. I know there are people who could give me a graphic description, especially of hell, maybe from the book of Revelation. But our concept of the universe is very different than the concept that existed in Jesus' day. And therefore, it's not so easy for us to visualize what it might be. Well, this man who had ignored the beggar at his door during his years on earth did the best he could. He appealed to Abraham to send Lazarus on a mission of mercy, to dip the tip of a finger in water and let it cool his tongue, while the flames agonized him. But Abraham did not rescue him. Instead, he reminded him of the reversal. During the plutocrat's lifetime, he had enjoyed good things and Lazarus bad. Now Lazarus is comforted while he was in agony. Besides, a great chasm separated the two now, so that none could go from heaven to hell, nor from hell to heaven. But the Dives, the rich man, evidently experienced the kind of awakening from his egotism and narcissism. For he then pleaded with Abraham to send Lazarus to his father's house to warn his 5 brothers. Abraham, however, had sad news. His brothers had Moses, the law, and the prophets, and should listen to them. It had plenty of instruction, plenty of time to learn that it was wrong to live the way they did and treat others like Lazarus the way they treated him. Knowing that his brothers hadn't caught their message, he appealed again for Abraham to send Lazarus. If someone goes to them from the dead, they will repent. Again, Abraham demurred. If they didn't listen to Moses and the prophets in their present lives, they wouldn't listen to someone who came back from the dead. Oh, a powerful parable. Will it touch the minds and hearts of people of wealth, specifically wealthy Christians today? And maybe those prosperity gospel people, just as Jesus observed about the rich man and his brother. If they had not paid attention to the many voices and sacred writings from the past, we cannot be optimistic. As early as the late 2nd century, Clement of Alexandria addressed the problem in a tract entitled How the Rich Man Can Be Saved. I have to laugh every time I read that title. The answer Clement gave was not an appeal to give up wealth, but to share some of it with the poor, to circumcise their wealth. As the Roman Empire was collapsing during the 5th century, many persons of vast wealth began to look toward the eternal kingdom by dispensing their riches, especially in support of those who chose to live lives of poverty and contemplation. We have numerous stories, very touching stories in a way, how they became poor and others might survive even. Not just become rich, but survive. Will wealthy persons today experience a change of heart? The redistribution of their wealth would require some person, for example, Bill and Melinda Gates, Warren Buffett, have established foundations through which their vast wealth can meet the needs of the world's poor in a highly commendable way. I've been impressed watching Bill Gates speak. He's trained in infectious diseases and things, so he can speak authoritatively about that. And the Gates Foundation has given billions of dollars for treatment of HIV, and now are giving billions of dollars in response to the coronavirus crisis that we face. I have to confess, once when I was speaking to our trustees at Baptist Theological Seminary at Richmond, I spoke about the wealth of Bill Gates as obscene. And I am sorry, I have to admit, I still think of possessing that kind of wealth as obscene. But I have changed my views about Bill Gates himself. I have to look more favorably at him. Facebook titan Mark Zuckerberg plans gradually to give away his entire fortune. Would any go so far as to take up Jesus' challenge to the rich youth to sell his possessions, give to the poor, and follow him? Or will most end up like that youth, the rich man in this parable? I think far more end up that way. The 1% hold on to their wealth, which is greater than the 90% in our culture has. Any serious change in distribution of wealth, I think, will depend on dramatic change in the way the society handles money. Free enterprise does not lend itself to equitable distribution of wealth. Governments must do more to facilitate distribution of wealth. Ours did during World War II. The highest percentage of tax was 90% at the end of World War II. Today it has dropped down almost to nothing. But this change must happen so that 1% of the people cannot own more and earn more than 90% of the population. Perhaps a future generation will find middle ground between a society dedicated to providing for each of its citizens and insistence on removal of all social control. It was Luke and not Marx who invented the rubric, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. Okay, well, I've ended early today. We have 11 minutes. So maybe you have some questions that you have raised for me. And I'm kind of afraid to what button to press here.
And you've got a few chats already.
Oh, okay. Okay, we have from Dale here. John Boyle once told me that we all have the right to become prodigal, to go to the far country. Amish give their children an opportunity to go to the far country and make a decision to return. Yeah, that's something admirable, and a lot of younger Amish do actually leave their places, their farms, and try out life in other places. I don't know how many of them return. I know there are not many who don't return, who are not able to relate themselves in a new way to life back on the farm. But I guess, what do y'all think? Do we have a right to become prodigal? I don't know whether we have a right, but we exercise the right as if we did, don't we? Almost all of us will find some point in our lives where we break free from control that we had known that had been exercised over us, and allow ourselves to maybe explore a much freer and more open approach to life. So it happens. Now, the thing is, a lot of those who become prodigal are not accepted back. Their parents find it hard to affirm them, to embrace them, and welcome them in the way the father welcomed the prodigal in this story. I think maybe that's what we have to struggle with, that we will get to the point where we will be welcoming of children, maybe a lot more of our children would live better lives. They would become more mature if we were able to affirm in the way that this loving father did in that parable. What do you think? Anybody have an opinion on that? Well, we have a question here from Alan and Ali. Is there anywhere God is not? Not in my view. I think basically this is what we learned from Jesus in Luke's presentation, that wherever we are, God is. Does not matter what circumstances we find ourselves in. I think we may find places where God maybe is more manifest. According to Luke, it would be among the poor, the needy, the ostracized, the rejects in society. But if I read Luke rightly, there is nowhere God is not. God is everywhere. And that, of course, should make create different attitudes toward our attentiveness. We should be attending to God everywhere, in all circumstances. We don't have to be single-minded about things, just thinking about things in the good times, in church, in a cathedral, in a temple, or someplace like that, to recognize that God is everywhere. And that, of course, would make our meditation maybe differ from what meditation may be for many. Thomas Merton's meditation was especially on nature. His photograph showed that is true. He meditated also on human artifacts and other things like that. So I think we could think of our attentiveness applying to everything, that we're always aware. We are always trying to be in touch with God. Then Quinn has this observation. The literary theme of brother squabbling with brother about inheritance was introduced in chapter 12, with Jesus refusing to take side. Luke then has Jesus launch into poetic oracle about divisions within family, which starts with enmity between father and son. In chapter 15, the parable picks up both themes. The specific vocabulary Luke uses to tell the parable is telling. When the young son comes to himself, he is depicted having stood up, which is a special word in Luke's Act, much used about resurrection, arising. The father then interprets to the older son that your brother was being dead and has become enlivened, was utterly destroyed and is found, which is a repetition of what he has already told the servant. It is narratively prolific of what will be to come in the story. It also gives basis to the conflict between older ways and younger ways. Yeah, that's very helpful observation, Quinn. I think quite right. The Jesus' use of language as storytelling is quite remarkable. And Luke, of course, made a remarkable use of language. He had choice of language which surpasses the choice of language in most of the rest of the New Testament, where the author's first language was probably Aramaic or Hebrew, and Greek was their second language. So they were not as apt at doing things like this as we find in the case of Luke. One reason I think that I especially have loved Luke is Greek is better Greek than that of the other Gospels. Paul, we find a lot of what we call solecisms in Paul's letters. That is, mistakes of one kind or another because he was not familiar with Greek. His first language was not.
Apparently I haven't done something.
Andrea, it looks like we've lost Dr. Hinson.
Well, it's not just us.
He was frozen, so we let it go.
It wasn't something you did.
She hasn't ended the session.
It's good to see everybody. I'll probably see you this evening.
You too, Quinn. Take care.
You too.
Stay safe out there. Bye, y'all.
Be safe.
So weird.
Where?
No, no, that's
Should we hit the road?
Yeah.
Andrea's not catching it.
Ain't it done? Okay.